Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Sadly, still wrapped in a pandemic that's resurgent. When, if things had gone differently earlier in the year, of course, as the guests who are with me today know too well, this surge now could have been avoided, largely avoided. You can see certain countries, like obviously New Zealand is kind of the poster child of what can happen when a country takes this virus seriously. Um, they're holding outdoor events and indoor events and having parties, and things are basically close to what you might call normal, although nothing around the world is normal. So we're going to examine the last 6 months and the next 6 months and years to come with here today on this Earth Institute Sustain What broadcast. I'm Andy Revkin. I'm at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. I run a nascent initiative on communication and sustainability. And this webcast started on March 15th as lockdown started. I felt the need to dive in and push some conversations towards solutions. And some of my early guests are reassembled here today. We were talking in early April about things. Howard Frumkin, an epidemiologist, MD, past director of the Federal Centers for Environmental Health, deeply involved in trying to carve paths that are more productive than those we've taken so far on this pandemic. Angie Rasmussen at Columbia's Public Health, Mailman School of Public Health, a virologist working, on not just this pathogen, but on others that have come before and whatever will come next to assess biological approaches to controlling this virus. And Tomas Pueyo, who early on, also in March, wrote an epic piece on Medium that essentially laid out the idea of flattening the curve. What I'm showing you also evolved in New Zealand. Susie Wiley, the science writer there and a scientist, and Toby Morris, very early on, came up with all kinds of clever ways to chart a path toward flattening the curve. And here you can see, it's just like in Christmas Carol, there's the ghosts of Christmas future saying, don't do this, do this, and things will be different. And here's this great way of showing what if you did something differently, how you could flatten that impact of this virus. Obviously, again, lots of work to do going forward. And here's Tomas's piece that got, I don't know, tens of millions of views at that time. And you've written 5 or 6 pieces since then, 4 or 5, that have attracted similar attention by digging in on this idea of moving from the hammer, which Dr. Fauci just yesterday on Rolling Stone in an interview was saying, the hammer is not what we want. The hammer gave us a moment, as Howard said here in April, a moment to do other stuff, to get into gear on testing and tracing and the capacity you would need in a country of 300 million people and variegated circumstances to get ahead of this. And so the first part of what we're going to talk about today is the epic fail we've all had. We're communicators, we're public health scientists, and a lot of information was purveyed. Angie, your Twitter presence grew from a couple of hundred to 150,000 or more. We've all dove in as well as we could, and yet circumstances still feel like they're stuck. This is just yesterday over a Trump. Oh no, this was a few days ago over a Trump rally. Someone tried aviation to get the message to those ungoverned rallies of unmasked people saying, super spreader Trump visiting Wisconsin, mask up. So, I mean, everything has been tried. And now we have this election coming up, which really can change profoundly some things. But I want to go back before we talk about the future to what we've learned in these 6 months. And maybe we'll start with Tomas, because you really did kick off that discussion back then in a big way. So what have you learned, about the power of communication, the limits of communication? Just looking around the world, you've tracked this issue, globally, and what comes to mind as what illustrates why we are where we are right now?
Oh, that's a hard one. On one side, you have countries who learned and did nearly exactly what they needed to do, right? You were talking about Australia, New Zealand. Germany is another one that has done quite a lot. Sweden has actually turned around a fair amount and is doing a lot of intelligent things for dancing. But then you see, as you mentioned, the US doing very poorly, and most of Europe outside of, say, Germany, not doing what they need to do. And when I go into the detail, I talk with the people in different places. It always strikes me, like, for example, just this week I was talking with a Dutch reporter, and it's a 3-minute interview. It took me 20 minutes to communicate the concept that what matters is not whether the new hammer is efficient or not. What matters is that they took 7 months and they didn't learn to dance. And so I think there was a lot of good reasons not to do what was right in March and April. But once the hammer had worked, especially in Europe, like, they just thought this was done. And I think there was little to do against that, because they were not receptive, because they didn't want to know, right? We always talk about confirmation bias and things like that. Well, there's a huge confirmation bias when your name is at stake and you've already succeeded, and you don't want to get into this situation of crisis again. So you don't pay attention to information that is against you. So I think that's definitely a big thing of what happened in Europe. They just didn't want to pay attention to dancing and to the potential of a new crisis. The summer was coming, the economy was going back up again, and so they just didn't want to know what they had to do for the fall.
And Howie, as an epidemiologist, you have a book out too on sort of the origins and future of pandemics, co-authored. And when you see how this has played out, and we're going to get to your essay in a minute, the one that you wrote early on about the Civilian Conservation Corps model, the solution model. But just right now, just looking at the last 6 months, you know, we all pay so much attention to Trump. There's also been Van Morrison. I mean, there is a collection of high-profile folks. In England, there was this insane editorial in the Times of London saying those pushing for masks were Nazis. And so it's a more widespread cultural resistance and variegated map. It feels in some ways totally predictable, and yet, you know, we know the logic of the data and the logic of history. So when you think about what Tomas just laid out in terms of how Europe and the United States have faltered, what comes to mind?
You know, Andy, I've been finding myself thinking about the Second World War a lot. That there was a threat to global peace in the form of Hitler, and this country and others rose to meet that challenge. And I can't help but be a little glum now that if a Hitler arose today, would this country have the capacity to respond? We failed so profoundly in responding to this threat. All it took was pulling together, training the right people, manufacturing the things we needed, personal protective equipment and so on, and rallying the troops, so to speak, rallying the entire population. And we just, the way we did that in the 1940s is hard to imagine replicating now. So I think about,
yeah, sorry.
Well, I think about communication a lot. Andy, you just mentioned some of the disinformation that's out there, that the polarization and politicization of public health. It's actually a very interesting phenomenon, isn't it? When it comes to climate change, which you know so well, it's easy to point to vested interests who have purveyed disinformation very deliberately. Here, it's a little less obvious in whose interest disinformation is, but there is a lot of disinformation out there. The combination of mistrust of government and the capacity of social media to spread disinformation virally. So we have a very polluted information sphere, which undermines the solidarity and rational common sense that we need to tackle the problem.
Yeah, and that's why I've convinced the Earth Institute we need an initiative on communication and sustainability, because these big looming problems that, especially when there's no, like with Hitler, there was ultimately a point when that picture changed. There was a lot of resistance in the States to getting involved, and then it changed mostly because of a direct, profound shock to our system. And here it's been this creeping, surging, amorphous is I did an episode on here with one of Angie's colleagues, Craig Spencer, emergency room physician, from the front lines, but no one can see the front lines unless you have a grandparent who was dying and you're Skyping with them. And so he did an epic narrative account on Twitter that became a Washington Post piece, but it's still amorphous. It's still distributed. It's, so Angie, having dived into this landscape, the communication landscape, and really making some ripples. I remember I met you on WNYC radio. You were out there early on. I was on, I'm sure it was talking about climate. You were talking about COVID-19 in March before lockdown. So what lessons do you take from what we've experienced so far?
I mean, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. I think what the biggest lesson that I've taken is that people don't have an appetite for science or evidence any longer. I think that we really missed an opportunity to do what Howard was talking about, a sort of national mobilization early on. Back in March and April, people, didn't like being locked down. They didn't like the hammer, but I think everybody was on board with it. And since then, it really has become so fragmented that now people, rather than looking at what the evidence is telling us in terms of what we need to do to control transmission and to really persist through this pandemic until there is a safe and effective vaccine available, has just become so muddled and confusing. The message that people are getting is really what they want to hear. It's not what the science is saying. Distrust in our various public health agencies, the people who should be leading these efforts, these response efforts and communication efforts, have been sidelined and discredited. And there's been a real erosion of trust from all ends of the political spectrum. So I think, the biggest lesson I've learned is that this is really the danger of politicizing a pandemic, something that's a public health crisis that really does need to be driven by science. When it gets driven by politics or people's opinions, then really terrible things happen. And we had over 90,000 new cases of coronavirus yesterday in the U.S. We are on track by probably next week to start having 100,000 cases a day. We are looking at overwhelmed hospital systems in many states. And it really is because there hasn't been any sort of cohesive central strategy to bring us all together in the name of science to combat this. We haven't really had effective policy. And now we're seeing that the Trump administration is effectively implementing a policy of do nothing, which they're sort of referring to as a herd immunity strategy. But effectively, it's really just do nothing and let the virus rip through the population. And this is really what happens when you don't have a central evidence-based approach that values saving lives above all else. It really has been fragmented and confused. And I think that the lesson we need to take from this is that this is no way to respond to pandemics. So the pandemics that are going to occur in the future, which are not a question of if, but a question of when, we really need to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and I think we all are clear on the issue of leadership and consistency. And it could have gone one way or the other. That idea, people are leadable. There's craving leadership in a time of fear and uncertainty. And unfortunately, sorry, Tomas, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And as you guys are talking, I'm thinking about this, and definitely there's a factor there, right? Because you have the countries that were most populist, US, UK, Brazil, Russia, all of them are in the same situation. But from another perspective, you also have countries that aren't and still have the problem, right? So Spain right now is not as populist as the US or UK. Portugal isn't, France isn't, the Dutch aren't, Belgium isn't. And so why each one of these countries did not do what they had to do? And so I think there's probably a layers of problems, and leadership is one of them, but it isn't the only problem.
That's such an important point. And even in the U.S., that very variable outcomes there's still some mysteries here, right? In terms,
That's right.
I mean, a lot has been cleared up. Angie, maybe you could talk briefly about air transmission, surface. Just give a quick sketch of what has become clearer, even as these big questions remain.
Yeah, so this is something I think about a lot because the issue of transmission in particular has been very contentious, and I'm still puzzled as to why it is. So we know that this is a respiratory virus, right? You get it from respiratory secretions of other infected people. That can happen in a variety of different ways. It can happen by you inhaling those secretions directly when they are in particulate form in the air. It can also happen when your body, your skin is exposed to those secretions and then you touch your nose. That's droplet transmission or contact transmission. And then there's indirect contact transmission or fomite transmission, which is when you touch a surface that has the virus on it. So early on, there was a lot of emphasis on fomite transmission. And while fomite transmission can occur, and there have now been a couple case reports that were probable fomite transmission, that's probably not the main mode of transmission. The main mode of transmission is likely droplet or inhalation of aerosols. What we don't really know is what the proportion of that is. We know that there's not a lot of long-range aerosol transmission, which is very good news because then a lot more people would be infected than have been already. But we do know that you can get transmission from being in close contact with people. That changes, your risk increases the longer that you are in contact with people in certain situations, such as enclosed spaces without ventilation. So we know this.
In El País, a beautiful visualization of that idea of time, indoors, time, proximity. These are all, and enclosed spaces and crowds. These are all things that are variables that will increase your risk of getting infected if you happen to be with an infected person. So this is actually not news. We've known that this type of transmission does occur with different respiratory viruses. What I think is news is the fact that there has been such an inconsistent message coming from various public health agencies about what the relative risks of all these different transmission routes are. And I think that has been tremendously confusing for the public. People don't really know how to protect themselves. They're emphasizing, let's wash down all of our groceries with Clorox and let's take all these surface disinfection precautions while neglecting to take the aerosol transmission precautions. And then the aerosol transmission route becomes more appreciated. And so people stop worrying so much about basics like hand hygiene and start freaking out about wearing masks and being in closed spaces with people. The thing is, all of these are viable routes of transmission. So we need to, rather than worry about what's the main mode of transmission, we need to be clearly educating people on all the different ways they can reduce their exposure risk. Howie, does this just make, but this circles back to, for me, if you're in deep uncertainty with a profound risk, that's evident, but you have this complexity around transmission. If you still know there's a basic common sense path to take, worrying when you're in a closed space for a number of hours with somebody, knowing that hand washing, there's no downside to hand washing except maybe dry skin. A mask wearing, the cultural element has poisoned it for so many that it just feels ridiculous. And being overly zealous about masks can be ridiculous too, when people start yelling at each other 10 feet away, 20 feet away in a park. So the common sense stuff, how can we break through there? Just can everyone chill out and just think a little bit? Maybe Howard and Tomas weigh in on that. Is that a harder message to take?
Well, I think that's not a hard message at all. We've all become accustomed to wearing seatbelts. We've all become accustomed to not littering. Behavioral changes can be normalized. Leadership helps. Social marketing helps. Good examples help. Part of the communication probably needs to include admitting that nobody likes wearing a mask. I don't like wearing a mask. I do it all the time, but
fogs up my glasses every time.
Yeah. But I wear a bicycle helmet too. You just, there are some things you do and you just suck it up and do it. It's not that hard to do. The Andy, I wanted to pick up on something that we mentioned just a minute earlier, if we could, when Tomas used the wonderful phrase "learning to dance." Have we learned to dance? So we're talking now about the precautions against spread, and that's an important piece of the story. The other important piece of the story that we haven't talked about quite as much is, what do you do when people do begin to get infected? How do we manage the infection?
Yeah.
And that's where we get into some issues that we've talked about before. It's quickly identifying people who are infected with a robust testing program, and then responding to the positive cases by isolating people and tracing their contacts. So I've been thinking about a counterfactual that I wonder if I could bring up.
Sure.
The armed forces. How many people do we have in uniform in this country? Well, it turns out we have about 1.3 million, and almost another million in the reserves and the National Guard. So well over 2 million people who are there to protect us against threats to the nation. How many do we have in the U.S. Public Health Service? About 6,000, so 1/3 of 1%. Which is the bigger threat to us as a country? Is it an invasion from another country, or is it a pandemic? Well, the last 75 years would suggest that the pandemic is a much bigger threat than an invasion from another country, and that's probably going to be more true going forward. What if we had a public health force stood up and ready to protect us from pandemics, so that when something like this happened, we would have people ready to do testing, including logistics experts who could get the testing equipment out where it needed to be quickly and then process the tests, and ready to trace contacts, and ready to go to every restaurant and put up plexiglass shields, do all the work that has to be done to deal with the pandemic. Why aren't we defending ourselves as a nation against pandemic threats, including training and equipping and standing up the necessary workforce the way we do for military threats?
Well, this is a perfect transition. I just wanted, there's someone else I have to bring in now, Matt Simon from Wired Magazine. Hey, Matt. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me. Good,
yeah,
thank you.
And Eliza Barclay, who was on here a couple of months ago with Angie talking about the ecological origins of these viruses, is going to be with us in a few minutes too. So Matt, and sorry, Angie, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I saw him in the
No worries.
And Howie, back in May, actually on this show in early April, you articulated that idea of a responsive, large investment in preparedness and response, including a jobs plan that back in, remember, the economy collapsed, shut down completely. This administration claimed it was all about jobs and did scratch. You made this point so powerfully in April on here. The lockdown, the idea of lockdown, you said, Howie, it's an opportunity. It's a moment to do the other stuff, to get that workforce underway. And you wrote a piece that ran on Medium, a new deal for coronavirus recovery. And you articulated, based on what happened during the Great Depression, you articulated right here, imagine a national recovery corps employing millions of Americans. And this is for tracing and testing, for infrastructure improvement, and also for the environment, for the energy economy. And that has built force recently. And Matt just wrote a piece for Wired that builds on this much more and gets at this idea that there are actually people in Congress already kind of finally. Matt, I don't know how long ago people were starting to press for legislation or actually to do this, but that articulation back in April seemed very powerful, and you've kind of built on it here. So let's dive in a little bit on this point, on the opportunity cost of not having done that. And then here we are at this transition, I wanted to make this show about what can we learn from where we failed so far and succeeded so far, and how can we build forward, regardless of how the election transpires. Obviously, one course on 11.3 will take us in a very different place. So Howie, so you had that idea back then. Matt, can you just fill us in on how this picture has expanded and evolved?
Yeah, so this weirdly came out of some reporting that I was doing for California wildfires, where there was actually an op-ed from a couple of researchers, I believe it was on The Hill, arguing that for the very specific case of bringing back the Civilian Conservation Corps for fighting wildfires, actually more specifically pre-treating the landscape to avoid wildfires. So that would be controlled burns and things like mechanical clearing, where you take a bunch of machinery and clear out the brush. So the problem obviously in California is twofold. We have been fighting wildfires for several decades now, putting them out as quickly as possible to protect populations. But the second part is of course climate change, which is making these fires all the more intense and deadly. So these two researchers, this came up briefly in one of the stories I was doing when the fires were burning really badly here in California, had floated this idea, and I thought, well, that seems like a no-brainer, right? Especially since polling has shown that 80% of Democrats and 75% of Republicans agree that we should bring back the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is a pretty astonishing agreement in a country that can very rarely find that sort of common ground. So yeah, this has been actually floated previously over a year ago, actually, by Marcy Kaptur, the representative, had floated this idea it was just legislation, bring back the Civilian Conservation Corps. And then Senator Durbin earlier, I think it was in September of this year, floated additional legislation in the Senate. So there is a broad support across the political spectrum for this thing. And a lot of people are asking, well, what are we waiting for in the middle of a pandemic? Put people back to work, both improving the landscape by doing things like treating for wildfires, restoring wetlands and things like that. Yeah, what's the holdup, really?
Yeah, and again, I remember back in 2016 during the Trump campaign doing reporting on some aspects, he had a grand plan for infrastructure that never happened. There's been all these grand plans. You know, the Republicans could have pushed this forward just in the logic of the energy transition we need, you know. And now with the pandemic, you would have thought, kaboom, but you know, they have an Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, which just put out this report, Angie, I'm sure you saw, hailing among their achievements, controlling the coronavirus. I don't want to make this too much about the politics. I want to make this about like what are the pathways, but boy, oh boy. The logic is utter there, Matt. It's like, just like the logic of flatten the curve was so clear in March. And yet here we are. Do you see, Matt, do you see signs right now in Congress that, you know, is there an alignment that could come out, you know, in January that could make this happen?
Yeah, I would hope so. I think, you know, the signs are pointing to all hands on deck for some sort of coronavirus recovery, some stimulus package. But why could this not be a part of that? Why not fold in the legislation that's already been floated? Durbin's had, I think, appropriated something like $55 billion, which is, you know, a drop in the bucket as far as stimulus funds are concerned. The idea here with the coronavirus recovery is to, of course, get people back to work, to stimulate the economy that way. This is a win-win. You do that by putting people to work, both in cities, interestingly. So you could do things like planting trees, which helps mitigate the heat island effect, but also in rural areas. You can also have this idea that for folks that are willing, they can actually travel to do this. You can have local stimulus in the economy, but also folks that want adventure. And this is actually, there's this sort of romanticization of the Civilian Conservation Corps, even though it was problematic in some ways. It was racially segregated and open only to women, or excuse me, open only to men. So now is, I think, a chance to, you know, address those historical wrongs, and, you know, two birds with one stone. Let's do the ecological recovery as well as the economic recovery.
Hey, Howie, I was just going to turn to you on this too.
Yeah, in terms of learning from the pandemic, there is another emergency going on in the country. We've referred to the pandemic itself. We've referred to climate change. Matt talked correctly about the ability to tackle climate change mitigation and adaptation with a large federal workforce. But there's a third emergency, which is the breakdown of social solidarity, civic responsibility, citizen engagement. I think we might be able to address that emergency also with something like a revived CCC or WPA. Imagine if hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans rolled up their sleeves and worked together on jobs like controlled burns or insulating buildings or installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure. that couple of years of service would bring people together across racial and class lines.
Totally.
And at its best, if well administered, without graft or corruption or incompetence, I think would again signal that we as a people can pull together and tackle big problems. And boy, do we need that message.
I have to put in a plug on Monday, the last show before the election. We're holding a special session on how to hold a difficult conversation. And the example is race with a songwriter I've known for a very long time, Reggie Harris, who is an educator and a storyteller. And he is descended from the slaveholder Wickham. And there was a whole white lineage from Wickham, of course. And they've recently reconciled. Parts of the family, actually, before what happened this year with statues, the family found a way to converse around race, and several of them were petitioning the government to take down the statue as early as 2017 through having that regular exchange with Reggie. They found each other, and it just shows you that exposure, time, getting past that moment when you're just feel like you're an emblem of something is crucial. And Peter Coleman will be there. Reporters have to work at this too. I will have Amanda Ripley, who has been pushing the case for complicating the narrative in our stories. And I'm with you, Howie, on this completely. So tune in on Monday for more on that. I just would like to hear from the others here too. And now I think I see Eliza's coming in. Hold on one second. Eliza Barclay will join us in a second. She looks like she's just turning on her camera. And Eliza Barkley, Science, Health, Environment editor at Vox. Great to have you with us. And can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm late.
No.
I'm just getting my connection sorted out. 1 second.
That's okay. We just turned from the failures of the first 6 months to signals of what we can do going forward. Howie and Matt Simon in his Wired story had articulated pretty detailed architecture for a government investment and leadership on jobs for resilience, jobs for COVID-19 tracing and testing, for wildfire resilience, for all the weatherization you would want under any kind of anything looking like a Green New Deal. So we're in the solutions section here, and she'll come back in a second. Tomas, you're scanning the world this way, and again on the capacity for tracing. Whoops, that's interesting. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you, Andy.
My camera turned off. I'm still here. Tomas, around the world, New Zealand is too much of an outlier as a small country. Where have you seen examples of the capacity issue being gotten at in a good way? Are there other countries that have kind of dug in on that?
Yeah, so super interesting. A few quick thoughts on this, and a couple of things that you also mentioned. First, on the conscription, interestingly, Sweden has it, and it has both the military service and an alternate civilian service for people who don't want to do that. And social cohesion is much stronger there. And so there's actually much more alignment in the message, right? So actually in Sweden, when Anders Tegnell decided that they were going to follow that path, it has a downside that most of the rest of the country shut up and did not want to push back too much. And those who did push back were confronted with lack of patriotism and things like that. So I think it's very important. I agree that it's something that could help. It also obviously has some downsides, but I think the upsides are better than the downsides. With regards to the question you're asking, so a lot of island countries actually have done pretty well, and the Caribbean is done pretty well. East Asia, outside of China, nearly all of these countries are island countries, right? Taiwan is one, Japan is one, South Korea really is one. In the Western world, Australia and New Zealand are the ones that have done it the best. Iceland did a pretty good job until it was reintroduced, and we'll talk about that in a second. But not all of them have done it so well, right? Ireland and the UK haven't. In the UK, I think leadership probably matter a lot. but that's not the case with Ireland, right? So what happened in Iceland and Ireland, I think, are two really important points. In the case of Iceland, they mostly had a very, very strong fence, what I call a fence, right? So controlling people coming in. But they were relying on everybody respecting the quarantines for people coming in, and not everybody did. And so there was a second wave. In the case of Ireland, they just applied the hammer, and now they're applying another hammer. And so it's just not doing enough. And one, what is that they're not doing enough? I'm going to echo the point around testing, tracing, isolations, and quarantines. But a lot of the focus being on testing, and in this conversation on contact tracing. But very few people talk about isolations and quarantines, and specifically their enforcement. Right? And so that's not something that we like to talk about. But testing and contact tracing is just the intelligence, is to know who you actually need to do an action on, which is the isolation and quarantine. And if you don't enforce the isolation and quarantine, everything else is worthless. And we don't enforce these isolations and quarantines. For the lockdowns in Spain and France, for example, each one of these countries applied more than 1 million fines. They've barely applied any for isolations and quarantines. And so that, to me, is the craziest part of the management, of the stupidity of the management, which is, it is too hard for me to isolate a few people, so I'm going to go and isolate everybody with a hammer. That sounds crazy.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point. And I don't know if others here have dug in on data that demonstrates how these differentials occur. You know, that's a harder thing to get at. How do you compare countries' fining ratios of fines on the different?
Well, one of the key ways to do it is what are they talking about? If they don't talk about ratios of isolations and quarantine, right? For example, percentage of contacts that end up isolated or quarantined, or number of fines applied to isolations and quarantines, because that's also a message you want to communicate, right? If the point of fining somebody for not isolating is actually not that person, it is the message you send to everybody else. Okay, you know, if you don't do it, you're gonna get a fine. And in Taiwan and South Korea, it's a $10,000 fine, right? Wow. So people get the message, and then they start abiding by it. And so if they're not sending the message, it means that they're not doing it. And most Western countries are not sending the message.
You had a New York Times piece on this recently, which is a pretty impressive story. I'm glad my former colleagues found time to put it in. And this gets at this issue. So I guess what you would say is be as rigorous in pursuing and enforcing those other strategies that tend to linger in the background. Howie, does that? I assume that resonates to some extent because your background in epidemiology, you would understand that. But what do you think?
Well, it resonates perfectly, but there's one piece I'd add to it, and I think Tomas will agree, and that is once you enforce isolation and quarantine, you need to provide the social support to enable people to comply. And that means bringing food to people's houses. It means bringing medical services, all the things that people need to do to be able to stay at home. Lots of people don't have the means to call Whole Foods and get food delivered.
Right.
And so that implies a spirit of solidarity, mutual support, and caring for each other, which is notably absent in our political culture and would be difficult to implement, but it's absolutely essential. You can't expect people to be totally self-sufficient when it comes to living at home for a couple of weeks.
Well, it feels like that relates, though, to what Matt's story and your calls earlier in the year were getting at, too, in terms of scaling up the capacities. So identifying the needs and the capacities you would have to have that enforcement and effectiveness, including an isolation quarantine, and then building the incentives, including with money. In other words, you could have restaurants that are aching and delivery services that are jobs, right? Could be subsidized as part of this, and it's a subsidy that everyone has recognized as a path out of this economic collapse. Has to have a push like that. Eliza, over at Vox, what kinds of stories have been, be pursuing these questions of like the what next question?
Well, I just wanted to mention that one interesting area where I think the US has struggled with isolation. An interesting recent example is on college campuses. We did a story looking at the range of ways that college campuses were able to or not able to provide support to students who needed to isolate and quarantine. You know, in some best cases, they were renting hotel rooms for them to get them out of the dorms. And then in other cases, they were putting them into substandard dorms, or in some cases, like not really giving them a way to isolate. And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting and really tricky question of how do you, like, there's a lot of different types of support you need to really help people isolate. And and I think that's a fascinating point that Thomas was making about, some governments threatening fines. I'm also reminded of, early in the pandemic when China built those, sort of hospitals very quickly, and they were funneling people immediately into isolation spaces. Like you didn't have a choice, if I recall correctly. And so they had an effective system. And I remember that was when we were reporting on, why was China so successful early on. That was one of the reasons, was that they had a very top-down system. But of course, it was involuntary. Like, it was involuntary isolation. We don't have the facilities or necessarily to do that. But I think, it's how do we get people in Western countries to adhere better to quarantine and isolation? I think it's a fascinating question. I'd love to hear what other people think too.
Angie, you're out of college, and actually you're part of the university that has physically gotten back onto campus. I'm not sure if you are personally yourself, but the research parts of Columbia are back. And I don't know if you've been tracking this issue of schools, variable performance at schools, and what lessons might lie there too. We can talk about that, Howie, of course, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've been tracking it a little bit, and at Columbia, people are back in the lab. I'm not. I have been into the office, but my personal opinion is that if you don't need to go in, you probably shouldn't, just because we really still should not be going back to work. And I'm doing my part by working remotely, since I can do that. I think that, at some schools, it's been an absolute disaster in the way that they've organized it and run it. And I think that, this summer was a really missed opportunity for a lot of educational institutions. I think that there was a lot of wishful thinking going on, that, we'd have this under control, like come the fall, and, everything's going to be okay, and let's just try it. And, certainly at the University of North Carolina, for example, they were one of the first major schools to have a significant outbreak when they reopened in person. The fact is, and residential colleges are a really wonderful environment for this coronavirus to spread. Yeah. And there's just no way around that. And if schools are not providing the support that we were just talking about a few moments ago, in terms of allowing people to be able to quarantine safely, to isolate, we know already that you can't test your way out of this. Testing alone is not sufficient to prevent spread within the communities. Tests are flawed, and they are not sensitive enough to pick up every single person. We don't have enough tests to begin with. And I think there was just a lot of, sort of magical thinking about how, this is kind of like isolation in a dorm. People are going to stay away from each other. They're going to wear masks. We're going to test everybody. We're going to test wastewater. And the thing is, all of those things, when they're implemented in a haphazard way like that, they're not really effective. And that's what we've seen. And it really extends beyond schools too. I mean, I think that this applies to workplaces. This applies to any place that's reopening. You can't just focus on one intervention or testing strategy. You need to have a more holistic approach that includes all of these different measures. And things like testing and contact tracing, isolation and quarantine, these are really tried and true. There's centuries of evidence showing that this is an epidemiological strategy that works. There's just not enough of those older lessons being applied. People are kind of winging it. And that that is clearly not effective.
That circles back to that consistent messaging and someone being the coordinator or the leader. And Tony Fauci has been doing his best. Actually, on this show a week or so ago, Erwin Redliner, at National Center for Disaster Preparedness, long time, a pediatrician and a pretty powerful voice in this whole arena, had said it was time to step down. But it can't just be Tony; it has to be a cadre. Should just say this is we can't work for this administration anymore. I can't imagine being in that situation of being ignored, told you're an idiot, staying in there, and but making that judgment call on which of those, when do you cut and run, and then what do you do? So it's such an interesting moment. And us journalists, Eliza and Matt, for us, it's just been mind-boggling to watch this stuff unfold. Howie, you've been in government, in the National Center for Environmental Health, dealing with contentious issues, dealing with Congress, which is always divided. Is this fixable? We all think, okay, Biden's going to come in if that happens, and then things will just. How wishful is it to think that some big change is going to take place?
Well, it's not only the CDC that needs to be repaired from the damage of the last 4 years, but it's really a major challenge of repair across the government. State Department, EPA, Department of Education, Interior. There's a huge rescue operation that's needed, and I'm assuming that the Biden transition team is working hard on planning for that. It's actually interesting in the context of a conversation like this to ask, what would you do if you were on the transition team and you were planning on day one to begin to do things right? We've talked about a lot of the things that need to be done already on this call. You need clear communication and messaging. You need a workforce stood up with plans for implementing all of the control steps that we talked about. I mean, controlling the disease, not controlling people. The language is very important. This can't seem, in fact, even the hammer and the dance, Tomas's wonderful metaphor, has a little bit of danger to it because people don't like being hammered. And so it needs to be clear that the hammer is directed against the disease and not against people. But the messaging, the logistics of testing and contact tracing all has to be stood up very quickly. So I think, yes, I think that it is salvageable. I think the historical knowledge in the agencies is still quite strong. I think a lot of people want to join this effort. And so I think there will be a hiring spurt at a lot of the agencies that need their workforces back. And I think we'll see really a burst of activity after the inauguration, assuming that the election goes well.
Yeah. Tomas, you've been focusing on communication and messaging, and also you work in the education arena or online through your company. So I guess maybe that gets back to the lessons learned question. Is there a way to articulate this? Is there a new challenge, a new communication opportunity? I love what Howie just said. I'm just going to feature it on screen here. The message should be controlling the disease, not controlling people. I think that's been one of the reflexive responses of a lot of people who don't want to be controlled. And I don't know whether messaging is enough to change the tide, but what would a new 30 million view Medium piece be about?
So I think the hammer and the dance made sense for these two different phases, and it's very clear what the hammer is. The dance, though, is like, oh, what is this thing? What do we actually need to do? And because it's a checklist of a lot of things, actually understanding what that is hard. And so what I've been thinking is, how can you put this in a way that is super intuitive to really understand the entire thing that you need to do when you're dancing, and then the specifics too. And I want to use the metaphor that has been shared recently around the Swiss cheese strategy, right? And so the way I think about it is, there's really four big layers of defense, and none of them are going to be perfect, but together they can stop the pandemic, right? The first one is you don't get people infected in your community, which means you need a fence. You need a way to control who's coming in, are they infected or not. If they are, you isolate or quarantine them, and if they aren't, they can go through. It's not going to be perfect, right? Because you don't want to get everybody in a natural quarantine of 40 days, right? But you can do some great things. Rapid tests, for example, a PCR in the 72 hours before that, a couple of rapid tests within 4 days. There's a lot of things you can do. But you don't need to get, you must avoid getting people into your community. If they do get into the community, you want to avoid them meeting other people, right? And so that's where you have measures such as limiting the size of gatherings. And there, again, Sweden has been very intelligent throughout the pandemic. They limited, I think it's 50 people, right? You don't want to have big crowds. You want to avoid the super spreader events. If there's more infections, you want to narrow down that number. And this is also what lockdowns do. What the lockdowns do is avoiding people just meeting each other. Right, so that's the second tool. The third tool is if they do meet, let's make sure they don't infect others. And so that is the contagiousness that we're discussing, right? Have all your meetings in the outdoors, have some physical distancing, you wear masks, wear goggles. If you are indoors, have good ventilation. If you cannot have good ventilation, increase the temperature and the humidity, have good filters, right? So all these things reduce the contagiousness of people who are actually meeting. And then the last piece is if you end up infecting somebody else, we need to be able to identify and neutralize that quickly. And that's test, trace, isolation, quarantines. Right? And so those 4 layers are the big ones, and each one is made up of their own little measures. But with that, you can understand what are the different strategies you can do. And when, for example, a country is applying a hammer only, what they're saying is, I'm going to apply layer number 2, which happens to be the most expensive of them all, because the economy is drawn by when people interact, when people connect. And so layer 2 is actually the one you want to avoid, right? And so that's why all the other countries that are now successful have been doing a combination of the rest. For example, every single country that's been able to control the virus has a fence. There's not a single one that hasn't. Right? And Germany is a good example where they were doing a lot of other things really well. They didn't have a proper fence, and now because all their neighbors are infected, the infections are going back up. So you want to do a fence. You also want to do test, trace, isolate, quarantines, because that's relatively cheap. And the same thing for contagiousness. If you can push everybody to go outside, wear masks and goggles, that's a cheap one, right? And so out of the 4, the 3 that are cheapest are precisely the ones that aren't the hammer, right? And so that's I think helps people understand what are the types of things that we want to apply.
By the way, I'm showing again Susie Wiley and Craig is it Morris? The XTOTL is his Twitter ID. They've done these fantastic sets of visualizations. Here's the Swiss cheese idea. Obviously, the more layers, the less gets through. And this is a probabilistic problem. So to get to that level of control, you can put in those layers. I just can't recommend their visualizations highly enough. They're pretty cool. And Vox, you probably have done your own variants on this because you guys are so innovative with visualizations as well. Which makes me still excited that there are possibilities for communication impact here. And let's go around the room one more time on that question. Like, what would success look like? Let's say, and we didn't even talk about vaccination communication, which is a whole nother mess. Trust, we talked about trust being a necessary predicate, and it's been completely demolished. But we'll leave that for another show. So just like 6 months from now, after a new administration is in, a new Congress, what would it feel like, either as a journalist to be covering something that you think is getting in the right direction, or as a practitioner like Angie or Tomas as a member of the public who dived in here? We'll just go around here a little bit. Howie, for you, and then around the world here.
Well, I think we would have implemented a lot of the disease control steps that Tomas just referred to. I think he's exactly right. So that means that the agencies, both at the state and the federal level, would have been strengthened. People have been hired, and we've put into place all of those control measures, and the disease is dwindling. But at the same time, these days, you never solve just one problem at once. Right. So we need to be thinking ahead to the long-term emergency, against the backdrop of which this short-term emergency is unfolded. That's climate change. So it would be really good if we had implemented solutions that could begin to address the climate crisis as well. We haven't talked about climate type learnings that have emerged from COVID, but it's really interesting. The ability of much of the workforce to work remotely, reducing travel demand and therefore reducing the carbon emissions that come from travel. Just one example, the ability to reduce transportation and thereby reduce air pollution. People's craving for time in green space and nature as a restorative during the pandemic is kind of a window into how much people like those assets in communities. But boy, that's a great way to blunt the urban heat island effect and to absorb carbon. So thinking about the lessons coming out of the pandemic that we can use for the long-term challenge of tackling climate change would be another measure of success in 6 months.
Angie, what do you think about that period of time?
So I've looked at the Biden plan for how policy in pandemic management would change going forward. And what he has proposed is exactly the type of strategy that I'd like to see over the next 6 months. It refers to changing the way that we are talking about the virus, obviously, rebuilding trust, rebuilding the public health agencies that for decades we've relied upon and that have been so undermined by the Trump administration, making sure that not only are we developing safe and effective vaccines and therapeutics, but that they are going to be equitably distributed, making sure that there is a national mask mandate to overcome people's personal objections to wearing masks and implementing these non-pharmaceutical interventions. These are all nationwide efforts to combat coronavirus. And it's really, I'm glad you put that up, Andy, because if you scroll down a little bit, you see that it's really driven by the principle of letting science guide the pandemic response. One important component of this plan is to do what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, to enhance our policy mechanisms and our preparedness infrastructure. So reinstating that Office of Pandemic Preparedness that the Trump administration shut down, that had been started by President Obama. I think the Biden plan, if there's anything wrong with it, is that it doesn't go far enough with regard to pandemic preparedness and response. It talks about reinstating the PREDICT program, for example, to look for new pathogens that may have pandemic potential, but that doesn't even go far enough. We need to make a considerable investment in pandemic preparedness and response strategies, and that includes doing something like building out the public health service, as Howie was talking about, or reinstating something like the Civilian Conservation Corps to address this. And that also, as Matt pointed out, gets at issues of climate change and environmental issues. We really need to invest heavily in this area going forward, both in terms of research as well as in terms of developing plans for what we're going to do when one of these viruses inevitably emerges. So if Joe Biden is elected and begins to implement this, that's forward, looking beyond the first 6 months. That's what I most want to see, not just how this pandemic is going to be controlled, but to make sure that we're taking the proper steps to ensure that this never happens again.
And Eliza, as an editor there, when you're thinking of the stories that need to be dug in on, I remember Jay Rosen on this from NYU here in March. He did a session. He said, testing is story number one. It should be, and much of that has borne out as not having been the story because the politics has kind of torqued the story away from the actual practical things to measure. But what do you think of, what's the story 6 months from now? I know that's a ridiculous thing to ask.
Very quickly, I need to.
Tomas wanted to say that.
All right, Tomas has to leave. Yeah, I forgot.
Bye,
Tomas,
guys.
take care, man.
Bye, Tomas.
Thank you for being here.
Well, I actually had a thought for your response to your previous question, which was, what would we like to see in the next 6 months? And for me, top of mind is reinstating daily CDC press briefings. I would love for those to come back. I don't know if that's in the Biden plan. Do you know if it is, Angie?
I don't know offhand. So there were 7 points to the Biden plan, and each one of those has a series of sub-bullet points, but it's more broadly addressed in the sense that the CDC needs to be rebuilt and they need to be playing a key role in guiding pandemic responses. I would think that daily scientific briefings from the CDC and from the NIH would be key.
I'll show it just so we have it. It's right
Yeah,
there.
I mean,
oh yeah. Okay, great. It is.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, that. And I think just to expand slightly, I mean, clearly one of the huge problems from a communication standpoint of the last 8-9 months is that we have had so many politicians communicating public health and doing a really terrible job. And one thing I've sort of remembered or learned in the last 9 months is just how critical it is to have trained people who have experience in pandemic response, pandemic communications. The epidemic intelligence service folks who are trained at CDC and now work throughout our public health system. There's a really specific skill set for how do you talk to the public, and how do you inspire rapid behavior change. And one of the critical things is of course consistency, and we've seen such inconsistent messaging over time. And so I hope for the day when it's scientists who are mainly talking to us and trained in consistent messaging and hammering home over and over and over and over and over the things that people need to hear, which is that masks prevent transmission. The vaccine, we have a system for testing vaccine safety. Here's how you can trust it. Things like that, which will be super critical down the road. So I think just giving the mic back to scientists and letting them really reinforce these messages, give them a chance to do that over and over. And then also, have, like I said, be able for the press to hear much more directly from the CDC is just so important.
So I'm still here, although it looks like I've lost. I think I'm going to call this show a little early because can you still hear me? I think you can.
Yes, we can
I'm
hear you.
having some technical issues with one of these stupid devices you have to use to connect your computer to everything else in your life. Matt, do you have a final thought? If I know you write about all manner of things scientific, so I'm not sure if you're going to be dug in on the COVID recovery beat, but what's on your mind going forward?
Yeah, I think we'll be doing COVID forever at this point. So I think for me, it's twofold. I hope to be writing in 6 months would be, of course, there should be a giant green stimulus like we did after the 2008 crash to get the economy back going and to address climate change. And a large part of that, I guess a small part in the grand scheme of things, $50 billion towards a civilian conservation corps could go a long way for preparing coastal cities for sea level rise and restoring wetlands, which helps absorb storm surges and things like that. That's what I would really like to see, and there should be bipartisan support for that. And I think the second bit is there's kind of this interpersonal aspect to this. I published a story on Wednesday about how to talk to your families about holiday gatherings. Specifically how to tell your family you're not coming. So if you can't agree that everything should be outside, everybody should be 6 feet apart, everybody should be wearing masks, what's the psychology there of discussing this in a civil way? And I think maybe that has been a shortcoming in America, where we have felt pressure to be around our families, even though we are uncomfortable with the varying degrees of precautions. So I think the holidays here will be a really interesting test of that. Are people getting more comfortable with talking to their family about taking the proper precautions? That's what I would hope.
That's great. Hopefully you can still hear me. I think that's a wrap for today because of what's going on. I want to show everyone Sunday's show, assuming my camera works more. is one of our weekly Sunday get off of the news, no talking heads hashtag shows, although we will be doing some talking with the great entertainment performance artist, Reverend Billy Talon, whose church is the Church of Stop Shopping. I first wrote about him in the New York Times way back in around Thanksgiving, you know, when the Black Friday he was doing, they go to Walmart and they stand outside and preach against overconsumption. And the fantastic songwriter Dean Friedman will be here. As I mentioned earlier, on Monday, the show will focus on how to hold difficult conversations. This has been a great episode today on next steps in this pandemic with Howard Frumkin, longtime public health expert, University of Washington Emeritus Center for Environmental Health author, Angie Rasmussen, hardworking virologist and Twitter source of reality, Matt Simon at Wired, and Eliza Barclay at Vox.com, and earlier Tomas Pueyo, who's I'm sure writing up another special magical piece on how to communicate more effectively. So Sustain What, this show is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. That's the last half century of so of our life on this planet. And now the great pause enforced by this virus. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one element of the Earth systems that's changing faster than the actual environment around us. The webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. And it's always a work in progress, as the technology here is showing. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide, and get in touch with me with ideas. That little distracting scrolling bar at the bottom tells you how to do that. Thanks again to my guests and to everybody who tuned in today. Get out there and vote. Vote your asses off. As one performer sang on my session last Sunday, vote as if the future depended on it, because guess what? It does. Thanks all.